Anyone here wish to make the world a better place? Okay, so what about the rest of you? Then don't raise your hand. What does this imply? You don't wish to make the world a better place? Come on now. Really, to make the world a better place, we have to answer a different question first. What's wrong with the world? Right? I bet you've given some thought to that, right? What is wrong with the world? John answers both of those things in his gospel. He does so using more than one story. Last week we got the story of Nicodemus, where Jesus says this is what's wrong with the world. And he uses this guy who knew everything there was to know about religion and how you were supposed to act. And on the outward appearances, he was there. And Jesus says, you're missing the point. Today we get the story of a Samaritan woman. And Jesus gives us the answer, again, what's wrong with the world and what needs to be done with it. You've no doubt heard this story before. Jesus approaches this woman at midday and says, I'm thirsty, give me a drink. That's not a big deal to us. We think this story is just really normal story, but we don't understand the context. There's at least 4 reasons why this should have never occurred. First of which is a racial issue. You've got to go back about 1,000 years to understand this. The children of Israel, you remember them wandering in the wilderness, the 12 tribes of Israel in the promised land, well, they didn't get along, and they kind of split into 2 kingdoms, a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. And about 900 years before Jesus was born, another kingdom came in and took control of the northern kingdom and hauled some of the people off into captivity and left some people there. Some of the Jews that were left there over the course of generations started to intermarry with the Gentiles, the non-Jews. 300 years later or so, the southern kingdom gets taken over, and people are taken away from the promised land, including guys like Daniel. You remember the story of Daniel in the lion's den. He gets sent off to modern-day Iraq. Many of these folks, they don't intermarry. Several hundred years later, you're back in the promised land, and there is this racial divide now. Some intermarried, Jews and Gentiles. Others did not. So the Jewish people of Jesus' day looked down on the Samaritans because they were a lesser race. A racial issue. But it wasn't just a racial issue. They were also considered heretics. They were not the true believers, the true worshipers. That's why in our gospel reading, part of that story comes up. Who's doing the real worship? The woman asked Jesus. So we got a problem here. We've got this racial divide. We've got this religious divide. And then we got the issue of she's a woman and he's a man. It was scandalous for any Jewish male to speak to any woman in public. And yet here is Jesus crossing over the racial divide, the religious divide, and the gender issue. Things change much? Don't we still have racial issues, gender issues, religious issues? And yet there's a fourth reason why this interaction should have never occurred. And it was a moral issue. How many of you have already gotten your water for the day? You went to the well and got your water? Yeah, we don't do that, do we? But I've been in parts of the land where that's what they do. And guess what? When they go to the village well, when do they go? Early. They go in the morning because they want their supply of water for the day, for cleaning, for washing clothes, for preparing food. Do they go by themselves? No. They go in groups. And yet this woman is collecting her water at midday. You can guess why. The rest of the story kind of fills us in about this woman's moral issues. But if you think this is merely what it's about, you're missing the point. Yes, there's a racial issue, there's a gender issue, there's a religious issue, and there's a moral issue. So they strike up this conversation, and maybe that context is helpful. Maybe you need to think about, who do you have issues with? Who do you have issues with? Pastors would like to think you're discussing religion, so maybe you've had those discussions with other people who have different viewpoint. But what race would you not be caught dead having a conversation with, or gender, or type of person? Who would you not be caught dead talking to, let alone asking a favor of? And yet here's what Jesus is doing in the context of his culture, of his day and age. He asks for a favor, for help. But of course, this goes much deeper than a drink of water, doesn't it? Jesus talks about a living water, a bubbling water inside. That from once you've had a drink, you'll never thirst again. So Jesus is telling her, I've got something for you as necessary spiritually as water is physically. You know that, right? You can't go much more than 3 days without water. It's kind of like, no kidding. And yet when Jesus says these things in Scripture, I have something more significant, certainly as significant spiritually as water is physically. We kind of dismiss it. The living water. So maybe now would be a good time to ask, what makes you happy? Where do you find your satisfaction? Does it come from outside of yourself? What circumstances occur in your life when you're thrown off of that? Maybe it's career, a promotion, or a different job. If you just get that job, then you'll be happy. Well, maybe it's a restoration of a friendship or a relationship, a marriage relationship. If I can just rectify that, then I'll be happy. Maybe if my sports... Oh, wait, there's no sports to talk about. I'm going to leave that one out. Well, why aren't there any sports? Maybe you're saying, I just want things to go back to normal. Then I'll be happy. And there are other people saying, I don't really care about the coronavirus because I'm dying of cancer. I want my health. What is it that you say, if I got this, if I made it here, then I'd finally be happy? This is the woman at the well, hopping from marriage to marriage to marriage, looking for some sort of satisfaction. Jesus is saying, stop all of that. Stop it. I will give you something that, regardless of outside circumstances, will satisfy you. And yet we still press on, don't we? We still think if we have this, and this isn't to downplay advertisers, because I know some of you are into advertising, but like Apple has us, man. Like the iPhone stuff, maybe you're not into that, but some are. They do these commercials. What's next, you know? Oh, I think it was like iPhone 5, but apparently we're on 11 now or something like that. I gotta catch up. The next best thing. Oh man, that's going to satisfy you. Jesus says, just stop it. And even if you do get it, what happens? Is it complete fulfillment? Sometimes we throw Hollywood under the bus on this one. The movie stars, the rock stars, the athletes, they have power and money and good looks and fame. And many of them are what? Miserable. Dying of drug overdoses. Going from relationship to relationship. Messed up. Realizing that these things don't satisfy. And this is the woman of Samaria at the well. And Jesus offers her a way out of her disappointment. And she wants it. And she asks for it. And this is where the story takes an interesting spin. Jesus is willing to do all of this. He's willing to cross all of those boundaries, those taboos, and reach out to people that we would normally go, well, I wouldn't go there if I were you. You know what kind of person they are. He doesn't turn a blind eye to this woman, nor her life. And so he says, well, you know what? I'll give you the water, but before we do that, why don't you go get your husband? He asks her to do something she cannot. And she says, I don't have a husband. He says, you're right. You've had 5, and the one you have now isn't your husband. Yikes. He does not avoid the sin. He confronts the sin because he's noting that in order to understand this living water, you've got to face the facts. It comes from outside of you. It's given to you. We don't ignore or deny the sin. She had to face the bad news, and she had to admit it. You know, she had opportunity to lie to Jesus, didn't she? When people corner us, what's our tendency? Well, maybe you wouldn't call it a bold-faced lie. Is it bald-faced lie or bold-faced lie? Yeah, I don't know either. A big lie, okay? Do we take it? Give the woman some credit here. She doesn't. She admits it. And why is this the case? Jesus' interaction with her is changing. We don't hear whether he gets a drink from her, but she gets a drink from him. And the result is she goes back to her community and says, you have got to come see this guy. He's told me everything I've ever done. So she goes from an outcast, someone she should have never been in conversation with Jesus, to a believer with the living water, to a sharer, an evangelist. There's many reminders for us in this gospel reading, as many of John's gospel readings are that way. And you can pick out numerous things, but I just want you to focus on that aspect maybe today, that this living water, he's fulfilled our thirst as well. This isn't the only time Jesus said, I thirst, is it? It's not the only time Jesus asks for a drink. Fast forward. Outside of Jerusalem, on a tree, suffering, dying for us. He says, I thirst. And don't think that was just merely a physical thirst. It was a spiritual thirst. He was being disconnected from the source of living water, his heavenly Father. And he was taking on all this cosmic dehydration of sin upon himself. He was thirsting so he could quench our thirst. He crossed many boundaries in order for us to receive that. And that is something that cannot be taken away from you, and the circumstances of life can't derail that. No coronavirus, loss of job, relationships ending, it cannot. Circumstances outside of yourself cannot take that away from you. John clearly highlights this in John chapter 10 when he said, is it John chapter 10 or John chapter 6? He says, no one can snatch you out of the Father's hand. Paul says it this way. This is how we're able to rejoice in our sufferings. Because suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance, character, hope. And hope does not disappoint us. And notice the language. Why? Because God has poured his love into our hearts. I pray that as you go through life and your moments of dissatisfaction and wondering what is going to bring you contentment, that you'll realize it's already been given to you. It's living water. It's in you. Nobody can take it. Also, I pray that as you recognize that, you'll see a world that is parched and in desperate need of that living water. And if God can cross over those boundaries, so can we. Because he goes with us, sends us, and empowers us to do so. Make that cause you celebration this day, the living water given for you and for the world. For the sake of a world dying without Christ and to the glory of Jesus. Amen.